IQRA TV, I'm your host Ilyas Bulbulia and I'll be with you for the next hour. As our regular viewers are aware, on Just Law we normally discuss an area of law which is of interest to you, our viewers. And on this show we're normally able to cover matters as diverse as family law matters, immigration matters, personal injury matters, etc. So we normally discuss an area of law which is topical, which is of interest to you. And secondly, more importantly, this show is a live show. So whatever questions you've got, you're able to call in and ask us anything that you wish to ask us about any aspect of English law. The number that you'll be able to call us on should be appearing at the bottom of the screen. Just a couple of points before we get going. Obviously it's a live show, so we're not able to speak to you in a lot of detail on the phone. So if your matter does appear to be complex, then I'll ask you to leave your number with the control room, and then straight after the show I will give you a ring and we can have a discussion, a more thorough discussion about your query off air. Secondly, obviously because it's a live show, I'm not able to look at documents. So if it does transpire that I do need to look at some of your documents, then again I'll ask you to leave your number with the control room. I'll give you a ring and then we can have a look at your documents off air, and then I can have a more thorough discussion about your issues. But in my experience, in the vast majority of questions that we get in, vast majority of issues that we deal with, if you give us a ring, hopefully I should be able to deal with your questions live on air without the need to look at your documents, or without the need to have a discussion off air. So whatever your questions are, do give us a ring and hopefully we'll have a discussion about that. Now, over the last few weeks, we've been looking at a number of topics, and we've looked at how to make a successful application to come to the United Kingdom in terms of the requirements that need to be fulfilled. We've had a look at that. We've also looked at how, once somebody is in the United Kingdom, how you make an application to extend one's stay in the United Kingdom as well. And as our viewers will be aware, the system that we have in place for spouse applications is that once an application for a spouse application is successful, then the person would normally be granted a 2.5-year visa to come to the United Kingdom. So the husband or wife is able to come to the United Kingdom and join their partner in the United Kingdom for a period of 2.5 years. Now, assuming that everything goes well, after 2.5 years, or just before the expiry of that initial visa, the person from abroad is able to apply to extend their visa for another 2.5 years. So they've already got the initial 2.5-year visa, they're then able to extend it for another 2.5 years. And it's at the expiry of the second 2.5-year visa that the person is eligible to apply for indefinite leave to remain. So it's a total of 5 years that they now need to spend in the United Kingdom before they're eligible to apply for indefinite leave. Contrast that with the position in place for those who came under the rules that were applicable up until summer 2012. Those people came with a visa which was for 2 years, and then after 2 years they were able to apply for indefinite leave. So this is a slightly longer, slightly different system where they want you to complete 5 years in the United Kingdom. Now, what I did last week was to look at how you make a successful spouse application in the United Kingdom, and we've been looking at the sort of standard applications where somebody is in employment, earning £18,600 per annum. So we looked at how that person comes to the UK, and last week we looked at how you extend the visa in the United Kingdom. Now, once an extension visa has been granted, what I want to look at is what we need to do when the 2.5-year period comes to an end. So the person's now completed 5 years in the UK. How do you get indefinite leave to remain in the United Kingdom? Because obviously there's no point continuing to extend one's visa. The aim should be really that once they're in the United Kingdom, to try and get to that 5-year mark and then apply for indefinite leave to remain. The reason I say that is, as our viewers will no doubt be aware, every time you make an application to extend your visa, the fees that will be paid are quite extortionate. A typical application will cost in the region of £1,500 plus lawyers' fees on top of that. So, typically you're looking at around £2,000 with every application that is submitted. So once somebody gets to the 5-year mark, ideally, if you satisfy all the requirements, you should be looking at making an application for indefinite leave to remain. Just looking at the costs implications of that, again, it is very expensive to make an indefinite leave to remain application in the United Kingdom based on somebody here as a spouse of a British citizen. The kind of fees that somebody would be looking at would be something in the region of £2,300. Now, as time goes on, that will no doubt increase. So with the latest increase in April 2018, the fees that have to be paid for an indefinite leave application is currently in the region of £2,300. No doubt when we get to April next year, and April is when the fee increases are introduced, no doubt when we get to April 2019, the 2,300 fee that's payable at the moment no doubt will go up by another 5 to 10%, which is sort of typically the kind of increases that we are seeing year in, year out. So that's the kind of fee that will be applicable in the near future. But what I want to do today is to look at the requirements for submitting a successful settlement applications. What do you need to do? What kind of documents you need to get together? What the rules are? So let's have a look at that in greater detail. Despite the fact that we're looking at that today, whatever your questions are on any aspect of the law, immigration matters, etc., the number that you can call on will appear at the bottom of the screen. So please do pick up the phone and give us a ring, and we can have a more thorough discussion about your issues. Now, like always, when you make an application with the Home Office, there are certain mandatory requirements that need to be fulfilled. And as long as the mandatory requirements are fulfilled, they will consider the application to be a valid application. It doesn't mean that the application will be successful. What it does mean is that the application will be valid. And as long as the Home Office is considering the application, you will be regarded as somebody who is legal in the United Kingdom. So a good starting point always is, what are these mandatory requirements? There are a number of mandatory requirements that need to be fulfilled. We've looked at one, which is that the correct fee has to be paid. And as long as the correct fee is paid, that aspect has been dealt with. Now, if there is a problem with the fee, then what the Home Office will do is normally write to you. Once they've had a look at the application, once they've realized that there is a problem with the fee, they will write to you, and then they will say to you that you have a further 10 days to make the payment. Now, if you do get that kind of letter, it's absolutely imperative that the fee payment is made in time, because if you fail to make that payment, then the problem is that your application will be considered to be invalid. You'll be regarded as an overstayer. Even if you then make another application, pay the fee for the second application that you make, they will still consider you to be an overstayer. So it's important that the fee is paid in time. If there is a problem and you get a letter saying you now need to pay the fee, it's imperative that the fee is paid, because if you fail to do that, you will then be considered to be an overstayer, and the implications of that can be quite severe and significant for you and your family. So fees are one of the main mandatory requirements that need to be fulfilled, as you would expect. Now, secondly, some other more easier mandatory requirements that need to be fulfilled. And the other one is that a passport has to be submitted with the application. Now, what used to be the case is that a valid passport had to be submitted. That's no longer the case. Now, as long as a valid passport, a passport, an original passport is submitted, it is sufficient. Now, this does cause problems for people. For example, if just before the application for settlement is to be submitted, unfortunately, you've lost your passport. Now, what you then need to do is take immediate steps to try and obtain a replacement passport. Because again, as I've said before, if you submit the application without a passport, the Home Office will write to you and request an explanation as to why a passport has not been submitted. they will normally give you 10 days to respond, and there has to be a very good reason as to why you're not able to submit the passport for them to waive that requirement in your case. Otherwise, like we discussed about the fee, if they reach the view that you should have submitted a passport, an original passport, you've been given an opportunity to explain why you haven't done it, and whatever explanation you've come up with is not sufficient for their purposes, then again they will reject your application and your whole file will be returned, and at that stage you will be considered to be an overstayer. So when you make any further applications, they will consider it as if it's someone who is an overstayer who is making that application. So the significance of complying with that requirement is really important. In the same way that fees have to be paid in time, a valid passport has to be submitted in time. Now, if you find that you've lost your passport or there's some other reason why you can't submit your passport, you need to either get a replacement passport or you need to have a very good reason as to why you are not able to submit a passport. Otherwise, there could be difficulties with your application. So you could have a fantastic application where all the other requirements are met, but because you've not met the mandatory requirements, your application could be refused. Now, what's the other mandatory requirement that needs to be fulfilled? With your application, you need to submit passport-sized photographs, and again, they're not any passport-sized photographs. They're photographs which comply with the requirements of the Home Office. There are certain sizes that they will accept. There's in terms of how your photo is taken, you have to be a certain distance away from the camera. So in terms of how the size of your face that appears on the passport-sized photographs, that has to be comply with certain requirements as well. So just make sure you take proper photographs for yourself and your spouse if you're applying for indefinite leave. So we've looked at fees, we've looked at the passport size photo requirements, and we've looked at those requirements. Now, what else do we need to do in order to ensure that the application is valid? The other requirement is that the correct form has to be submitted. Now, seems like a very straightforward requirement to fulfill. You go online, work out which form it is that you need to submit, and today we're looking at settlement applications for spouses. So the form that would need to be submitted would be a Set M. Now, if it's a Set M form, you have to make sure it's the right version of the form that you submit. Typically, in my experience, the Home Office changes forms on a regular basis, and in my experience, I think the Home Office comes up with about 4 different versions per year, at least 3 to 4 different versions per year. And if you're submitting an application, you have to make sure that you submit an up-to-date form. Typically, where the problem occurs is that you might print off a form, start working on it, and then obviously realize that your application doesn't have to be submitted for a number of months down the line. So you come back to it, you fill a little bit more, you collect a few more documents, and by the time you come to submit the application, that version of the form that you initially printed off, that's no longer the current version. That could spell problems for you. Although there is some flexibility as far as the Home Office is concerned, they do allow you to apply on an outdate on a previous version of the form, as long as the previous version of the form was one that you could use up to 21 days before your current application is being submitted. So if the form changes today, you're sort of okay for the next 21 days. But if it goes beyond that, then the old form will not be accepted. So make sure your fees are right, make sure you've got the right form, make sure you submit the right passport size photographs, make sure you submit a valid, not a valid, but an original passport. So those are the sort of mandatory requirements. The other mandatory requirement, which wasn't the case before, and it's nothing to do with what's submitted, it's actually what's filled in within the application forms. And what the Home Office has now done is, within application forms, it's now made certain sections mandatory. So you have to answer certain sections, and if you don't answer those questions, again, your application is not valid. The Home Office will give you 10 days notice to submit the missing information, and if you don't do that, it will reject your application completely. And the implications of that, as I've mentioned a couple of times, is that you will be considered to be an overstayer. So as you go through the form, you'll realize that there are certain sections which are mandatory, sections which deal with income, sections which deal with accommodation, sections which deal with your personal history in terms of any criminal offences or anything of that nature. So it's important that those sections are filled in properly as well. If there are sections which you are not able to fill in, you have to explain why it is the case that you can't fill that in, because if there are sections missing, the current practice of the Home Office is when the application is submitted, they won't wait for a couple of months for a caseworker to look at it. They have a system whereby they make sure that all these mandatory requirements are fulfilled. So there'll be somebody there going through the documents which you've submitted. You know, have you used the right form? Is your passport right? Is the correct size photographs? Have they been submitted? Have you filled in the form properly? So in the initial sort of sift, they will look at whether the correct documents have been fulfilled or not, and if the correct documents have been submitted or not, the form's been correctly filled in or not. If that's not the case, you will be written to and you'll have 10 days to do that. We'll look at the actual requirements in greater detail after we've taken a short break.